Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 215 of Humanity Rising. I want to note as we begin today a couple of items in the news that pertain to the pandemic and events related to human well-being. The first, as many of you may have noted, the World Health Organization, after months and months of internal debate and politicking, has produced what has been called a highly choreographed report on the origins of the coronavirus. There was much speculation a year ago as to how it started. Early reports indicated it came out of the Wuhan, China lab, which was under contract with the CDC to test various coronaviruses. That was denied. There was reports that it could have come from the wet markets in China, where they sell live animals that have been often brutalized and aggressed upon in all kinds of ways. There were indications that it may have been the bats. And this was something that had currency, because the more we destroy the environment and natural habitats, species of all kinds, whether it was monkeys in Africa, which were the origin of the AIDS virus, could have very easily, particularly with the wet markets and the brutalization of animals around the world, could have been the origin. So the World Health Organization has concluded it was probably the bats, and that there was a low probability that it came out of the Wuhan lab. We all need to take that in, reflect on it, and make our own judgments. Another event in the news, which you may have noted, is the opening of the trial of Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was on May 25th that Officer Chauvin put his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes and 24 seconds. And even though emergency personnel, bystanders, even other police officers, even of the 911 responded, begged him to cease and desist because George Floyd was providing no resistance, he killed him. And George Floyd died. And now the trial has begun after, again, quite controversial jury selection. Derek Chauvin is backed by a fund that's coming out of the alt-right, well over $1 million, and a team of lawyers. And what we're now going to see is an epic trial about justice in the United States, justice for Black lives, and whether our judicial system can be blind as it holds the scales of justice. All that and more is happening in our world. In the midst of this, on Humanity Rising, each day we take all this in, but we do so within the context of psychological and emotional equilibrium, which we all need to cultivate. And in particular, for us, we like to take a moment and just center our attention in our bodies. Take a few deep breaths. Close our eyes and place your attention on your heart. Listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of thanksgiving and deep gratitude that you're alive. We're all alive at this very precious, critical moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you that has joined our program today, I want to commence our session by speaking a moment about shamans. If you look back over the history of human spirituality, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years ago, the earliest of the seers and spiritual guides were shamans. Shamans were the people, both men and women, among the early tribes that had the gift of understanding the language of nature and the language of society. They could commune with the totem animals, the bears, the eagles, the snakes, the owls, the animals that guided the tribe. Many of them could actually shapeshift into the animals themselves and return in their nighttime visions. So shamans have always been at the heart of human spirituality. And then when human beings started to aggregate into cities and civilization began, the shamanic impulse was morphed and transmuted into priests and monks, popes, and religious leaders of all kinds. But the shamanic impulse, that impulse in our collective memory, that capacity in our collective consciousness that heals, that communes with nature, that holds the larger whole and communicates it in a way that the contemporary society can understand, is, in my view, the fundamental capacity of humanity's spiritual journey, resonating with the whole and with compassion, articulating the idea ultimately of the holy into a language that understands healing. Words have power. And in contemporary society, in the midst of our modernity, with our vast educational institutions, the shamanic impulse has been channeled through intellectuals and academics. And so I'm very pleased today to introduce a good friend and scholar, Sandra Waddock, who's the Galligan Chair of Strategy and a scholar of corporate social responsibility at the Carroll School of Management at Boston College. She's written 15 books. She's written also over 170 papers. One of her books is on intellectual shamans and healing the world. So that as an academic and as an intellectual and scholar of note, she is also carrying that deep shamanic impulse that has been with us from our very origins. So I want to turn the program over to Sandra now. Sandra, welcome to this session on intellectual shamanism.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm just so absolutely thrilled to be here, and particularly with Andy Hoffman and Raj Sisodia, who I'll introduce shortly. If you can turn your videos back on, guys. So as Jim just said, shamans are the medicine men and women of traditional cultures. And as he noted, they're also the world's, they represent the world's oldest spiritual tradition. The thing is, shamans are found in every culture of the world, especially including in ancient times when they were well known in their communities. The paintings from the 17,000-year-old Lascaux cave paintings show what are believed to be shamans. So these spiritual leaders have been with us for a very long time. And often shamans, what shamans do is they move into other realms, often spiritual realms, to find wisdom or knowledge that is needed to heal the world. And so they will cross over into spiritual realms, get that information, bring it back to help heal their patient. I've argued in my books that the work of the shaman is very much needed in our modern world, and yet we often don't recognize that work is still continuing today. And shamans are, as I'm going to call both Raj and Andy here, intellectual shamans, but shamans can be found in virtually any type of work, any walk of life, because anybody can do the kind of healing work that is needed for shamanism, to be a shaman. It's a risky path. It's not necessarily an easy path to take. But I think given the huge crises that our world is facing, we all need to assume the mantle of the shaman, and we all can assume the mantle of the shaman, take those risks, and really sort of move the idea of the healing function of the shaman forward. So I'm going to give a little background on the book. I was interested in talking with some of my colleagues, the people I had most admired in the field, about their work. And I had been interested in the idea of shamanism for a very long time. And so I started searching the management literature and found that there were exactly two articles that I could find in the management literature that had anything to do with shamans. And both of them were written by Peter Frost and Carroll and Egri. And they talked about organization development specialists as shamans. And I thought, well, I think this construct is actually a little broader than that. And that, this kind of work is needed so many different places. And so as I interviewed 28 very well-known academics, about their work, it became clear to me that they were doing the kind of work that can be identified as a shaman. So the definition of shaman that I came to was that shamans are healers, connectors, and sense makers in the service of a better world. And those three, healer, sense maker, connector, those three functions are the core of the shaman. And the in the better world is really important because that is who shamans serve, is making people better in traditional cultures and making our world better. So intellectual shamans are a kind of a specific breed of this kind of shaman. And maybe I'll ask both Andy and Raj later if they how they felt about that term being applied to them. But they work in intellectual realms, and so as healers, they are interested in making the world better, and they're not afraid to say that. So oftentimes in academia, we like to say, oh, our work is objective, and we don't have any, we're just going to stand apart and be an observer of the situation. Well, we know from physics that that's not even possible, that observing something changes it. And certainly in our human world, observing things change things. When you start interviewing people or surveying them or gathering data, you are actually making decisions about things, and that information is changing people. So how you do that and the healing orientation that you take with that is really important. So but fundamentally, the shaman is a healer of relationships, and it can be relationships in yourself, the mind and the body, between you and others, between you and your circumstances, between humans and nature, which is a broken link that is much needed to be repaired today, as Jim alluded to, and between matter and spirit. This healing function is central to all shamans, no matter where they are or what culture they live in. But there are two other functions. One of them is connecting or crossing boundaries. And this connecting function is really important because too often we all work in our little silos, and we don't really see what's going on in the other disciplines or sectors or organizations that are related to us in important ways. And what I found was that the people that I interviewed, the intellectual shamans that I interviewed, weren't afraid to cross disciplinary boundaries, sector boundaries, practice and theory boundaries, teaching boundaries. They were sort of out there doing all of that kind of boundary spanning. Some of it very spiritually oriented, and some of it very much grounded in the real world of practice. And then the second function is that of sense making. And Frost and Egri called that function a spiritual function. They called it spiritual leadership. But that sense making function for the intellectual shaman, it's making sense out of what they found and what they've uncovered in their work so that other people can understand it, so that it can, and this is really important, change the cultural mythologies. Because one of the ways that shamans in traditional cultures work is that they often believe that when a person is sick, it's because there's something wrong with the cultural mythology, those core myths, those ideas that tell us who we are in the world and how we relate to our world are problematic. And as I think you'll hear from both Andy and Raj, they have, in really important ways, begun to make sense of our world in different ways. Andy around issues of sustainability and purpose, and Raj around ideas around what capitalism or business could look like if it took on a healing function. So it's about this sense-making function is really about healing those cultural mythologies. And I have more to say, but I think I'll introduce our two speakers today. So Andy Hoffman is the Holson Professor of Sustainable Enterprise at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He has joint appointments in the Ross School of Business and the School for Environment and Sustainability. He's written over 100 articles and chapters and has published 16 books, a lot of them on the processes by which environmental issues emerge and evolve, and he's received numerous awards for his work. His most recent book is called The Engaged Scholar, but he's also written Finding Purpose, How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate, and Flourishing with John Ehrenfeld. Andy is absolutely a pioneer in bringing issues and ideas about sustainability into business. He's gone much against the traditional grain of business schools, even at some risk to his career initially. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. He's written extensively about the power of purpose, especially around sustainability and transformation, system transformation. And some of his most recent work explores ideas about how climate skeptics form and hold their beliefs. And he's said in public forums where I've heard him that he has an inbox full of hate mail as a result of doing some of that work. Raj Sisodia is the FW Olin Distinguished Professor of Global Business and Whole Foods Market Research Scholar in Conscious Capitalism at Babson College. That's a mouthful, Raj. He's the global thought leader about conscious capitalism and healing organization. His breakthrough book was called Firms of Endearment, and it highlighted how companies that love their stakeholders significantly outperform companies that don't. He's co-founder and chair of the whole movement of conscious capitalism. Author of numerous books and articles, he most recently published a book called The Healing Organization with Michael Gelb and Everybody Matters with Bob Chapman, and also Shakti Leadership with Nalima Bhatt. He co-authored Conscious Capitalism with Whole Foods founder John Mackey. Raj started out as a marketing professor and moved towards looking at caring businesses when he engaged in this book called Firms of Endearment. And he's now globally known for founding the Conscious Capitalism movement. In recent years, he's branched even beyond conscious capitalism, working with these ideas of Shakti leadership, which integrates masculine and feminine, conscious, life-giving, caring, creative leadership. And his latest work is focusing explicitly on healing organizations. So let me start with you, Raj. The word healing has interesting roots. It's derived from the Old English word hal, meaning whole or health or sound or of good omen, and even sacred, as Jim alluded to in his introductions. the idea of working for greater coherence conceptually and in practice. Can you tell us a little bit about how you, your own journey to healing and how you understand healing in the context of the intellectual shamanism work that you've done, and how the idea maybe of conscious capitalism fits into that?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm just delighted to be with you and Andy and Jim and all the others. And thank you, Sandra, for really helping me learn more about myself. When you interviewed me for that book and then you published the book and I eventually read it, I didn't read it right away. I didn't even know what it was all about. It gave me a sense of what I've heard called identity refreshment. You know, you become more of who you are when somebody sees you and kind of puts you into a context and puts you alongside people you've admired for so long, like Andy and Ed Freeman and Otto Scharmer and so many of the other wonderful scholars that are in that book. So it really gave me a sense of clarity. There were two things that gave me clarity a couple of years ago. This was the year I turned 60 in 2018. One of them was a coach. And by the way, these were all women who gave me these insights. A coach who I worked with for the first time in my life. And after hearing the trajectory of my life, where I come from, the culture I came out of, which is not only Indian, but the warrior caste within India, which is, and within that, a very feudal subsect of that, right? So I literally come from these very abusive, hyper masculine, I would say, or toxic masculinity traditions, hyper patriarchal, misogynistic in many ways. And so I came from that extreme of that energy. And then I had a father who kind of embodied that. I had a mother who was the exact opposite, pure love and gentle and inclusive and, you know, unconditional love versus conditional love on the other side. And then I spent 45 years trying to prove myself worthy of my father by becoming a market warrior, right? By trying to achieve worldly success in the way that that's normally defined, power and profit and prestige. And it was hollow and, you know, it was not even that effective. I mean, I could only do so much because my father convinced me that everything that came naturally to me, my innate nature, my qualities were in fact, in a way, defects. I needed to be the opposite of everything I was. So I was living this inauthentic life, trying to actually suppress my own authenticity, trying to be something else and bring that to the world. My work was a job and maybe to some degree a career, but certainly not more than that. And then when I got onto that path, I was guided on, I would say, to that path, which resulted in Firms of Endearment starting in 2005. And then that opened me up. I distinctly remember the moment where I literally had tears in my eyes as I'm trying to write some of the stories in that book. And it was June of 2005. We were sitting in a writing retreat in the Poconos. And, you know, I said to my co-author sitting across the table, I said, David, I've never had tears of joy connected to my work. I have often had anger and frustration and other emotions, but tears of joy is like a completely foreign thing. And I said, I think my purpose just found me. You know, I have been, I knew what I was unhappy with. You know, Joseph Campbell talked about follow your bliss, find your bliss, right? That's kind of where, but Andrew Harvey has talked about follow your heartbreak. You know, what gives you, you know, greatest pain. And I had written a lot about what's wrong with marketing, what's wrong with business, you know, all the negative sides of it. The way we exploit people, the amount of money that we waste, how inauthentic it can be, and so forth. And so I had been following my heartbreak. I had actually, the original title, by the way, of Firms of Endearment was The Shame of Marketing. Think about that. I mean, I was in such a negative space of self-loathing. And it was really, I would have to say, it was not the shame of marketing, it was the shame of Raj. Because I was, in a way, I was not proud of what I was doing in the world. My inner dialogue was that my father got a PhD in plant genetics so that he could help cure world hunger. And I got a PhD in marketing so I could sell you some more potato chips, right? I mean, it was not, I didn't see it as an inherently self-justifying profession. So I had all this angst and unhappiness and self-loathing and all of that. And I was stuck in that space. But then when I shifted and I found this other pathway, and discovered this other way of being. And then we discovered that those companies were more profitable by far over the long run, 9-to-1, you know. So that whole story became incredibly powerful. And that became my life took a sudden shift from that point forward and elevated everything about joy and meaning and purpose and impact and relevance and all of that. And so then fast forward to 2018, I work with this coach and she hears about my father and my family and my work. And then she says, do you realize that you have been honoring your mother with your work for the last 15 years? That you spent 45 years trying to impress your father, and that wasn't your path. That was not who you are. And now you're bringing that energy. So I believe that ultimately it's about bringing what's missing in the world. And what's missing in the world is that mother energy. That is the healing energy. It's compassion, it's unconditional love, it's compassion, it's caring, it's inclusiveness, it's forgiveness, right? It's gentleness, all of those things. You know, we're out there fighting and destroying and killing and winning and, you know, all of those things. I mean, there's just too much of that energy and it's completely out of balance. So I think my pathway was illuminated to me in that way and made more clear by you and by my coach in that sense. And now what I'm realizing, it's not about me rejecting one and then going all the way to the other side. It's really about me becoming whole and me integrating the wholeness of both of those. There's a lot of wonderful, healthy aspects that the masculine energy brings us and can bring us and has brought us. And it's about integrating that and combining that with the beautiful qualities of the feminine. So as Martin Luther King said, we must be tough-minded and tender-hearted and all of that. So it's kind of become, now my pathway is integrating with what I consider healing, which you said is wholeness. And this idea of healing became such a almost an obsession with me. The way I define it is, it's about reducing unnecessary suffering in the world. It's about promoting joy, and it's about enabling healthy growth. So I believe we human beings are here to evolve ourselves because we have infinite potential, and we are here to serve and take care of each other. And we think of business, I think of business as a way to scale that. Business is a way to scale human development and caring. And when we do that, it becomes a source of great healing. But when you use it as an instrument of using others to fulfill your own ego needs, it becomes a source of suffering for everybody from customers to employees to communities to the environment and so forth. Right? So anyway, that's my sort of meta narrative of this journey. And again, I thank you for illuminating it in such a clear way.
Thank you. I love that story, Raj. And Andy, it relates to the question I want to ask you, because you've written, your career has followed what I'd call a slightly crooked path in finding your way to today's work. And I'm hoping you also could share a little bit about your own journey and how you persisted in doing the work despite the obstacles that you faced along the road. And you've written extensively about purpose and how it drives sustainability issues and purpose. So I'm hoping you can explore your own sense of purpose and why it was important for you to write about it for others.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
You know, when you first proposed this idea to me of the intellectual shaman, I found it a very a provocative mixture of terms. You didn't call it a scholarly shaman or an academic shaman, because we live in the academic world, which is the world of reason. And the world of the shaman is the world of spirits and the world of faith. And so oftentimes those worlds clash and they leave us this disjointed individual where I have my going to work and I put on my reason hat and then I live the rest of my life as someone who's a part of the world and more of a human being. So I found it a very provocative idea. I don't think of myself as a shapeshifter. I don't think of myself in the context of many of the ideas of the shaman, but I do like the word intellectual because I think there's a very big difference between an intellectual and an academic. We've all been around people in academia who can recite the last paper, talk about what the literature knows, which I think is a term designed to put people off. When I say to you, the literature says, you better know the literature before you challenge me. I think it's just a way to shut people down. I'm slightly uncomfortable with making this some kind of a individual, somewhat heroic trait of the individual. I saw a really great TED talk by Elizabeth Gilbert, and she talked about the idea of creativity. And in our society, the individual is imbued with this creative power. And we can talk about shamanistic power. What she pointed out in the talk was that if you go back to ancient Greece, the individual didn't have that power. That power came from a spirit outside themselves. They were just a conduit through which it passed. And in her talk, she describes a poet that she really admires who will be out in the garden gardening, and she'll feel that coming to her, and she'll have to run inside real fast and catch it as it passes through her. And I really like that metaphor because I prefer to think of myself as a conduit. I'm less important than the ideas I'm putting out there. That may sound corny and cliche, but it really is true. And so what I'm trying to do in my work now is really bring that individual back for students, for scholars, for students. I want to bring out the idea of management as a calling, as a vocation. What that means is look inside yourself. What are you here? What are you meant to do? There's a wonderful line by Mark Twain. He said, the two most important days of your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. And we live in a society and an education system that doesn't help people figure out that second question. Education is to get you a job to make money, and then that other half of yourself is not important. I think that's a huge gaping hole in our education system. In the role of the academic in society, I think also we have been turned into these machines that think that the only place where valuable knowledge lies within our A-level journals, and we can measure our worth by our H-index and our citation counts, which is nonsense. And so going back to the idea of the difference between an intellectual and an academic, we've met intellectuals as well. Those who can speak about the world around us, those we go to for advice. There are many academics that would not go for advice. To my mind, the difference is wisdom. You can talk about, there's a pyramid to describe the ascendancy of knowledge. We start with information, we turn it into data, we turn that data into knowledge, we take that knowledge, we turn it into wisdom. That final step requires an application of principles. We in academia don't do that. We stop at the knowledge step. We aggregate and organize information and make conclusions, but then we don't take that extra step of wisdom. And if I go to somebody for advice or I have a mentor, that person has that wisdom with advice that I would take. So this is perhaps a long, rambling direction to your question, but very succinctly, your original question, how did I get here? Dumb luck and a very, very healthy degree of ambivalence. I got into academia late, in my late 20s. I did not get it in it to advance theory or, get a high H-index or citation counts. I got into it because I cared about environmental issues and I wanted to focus on those and make change in the real world. All the rewards of academia are designed to pull you away from that. And because I was ambivalent, I stuck to it and broke rules that any of academics are listening right now. I'm here to tell you, a lot of those rules aren't real. A lot of people tell you, don't do a book. That's nonsense. Do a book. There are ways to do it and ways not to do it, but do a book. Find your own path. Define it for yourself. You will live a much richer and happier life.
Thanks, Andy. What you just said, two things struck me in what you said. One is that in addition to being an academic, I'm a songwriter. And a lot of us songwriters talk about the fact that the song goddess or the song muse will come and sort of hit you. It's not that, it's off. I mean, yes, it's hard work. It can be hard work, but it's often that you're channeling something that's coming through you in some way. So, and that creative impulse is not necessarily you, it just comes through you. And the other, I was thinking about wisdom, and I have defined wisdom in ways that are analogous to the way I think about intellectual shamans. So I think of the people I interviewed as the wise people in our fields. And my definition of wisdom is people who have systems understanding, so realistic view of the system, with an ethical component that people call moral imagination, combined with an aesthetic sensibility. So there is that sense of the creativity and the design features that get built into it, all in the service of a better world. So that really relates to the definition of wisdom, but also to how I think about what the work that the people I interviewed for this book, Intellectual Shamans, are doing, including you.
To hang on that word service, I mean, the people we admire, the people of wisdom are outward facing. They're thinking about the world around them. People within academia are about status. It's inward focused. It's about accolades for me. And once you see that, you especially when they start to move up in deanships and things like that, you've got problems.
Yeah, I don't know how many people on the other end of the microphone are academics or not, but there's a lot of pressure in our fields to get a lot of publications and so-called impact factors and citation counts and things that have nothing to do with the quality of the ideas that you have, or how you're actually expressing those ideas, or whether those ideas make a big positive difference in the world. Let me turn back to Raj just for a minute here. Raj, your connecting has been really important to your work, particularly as you moved away from the marketing, as you described to us a little bit a while ago, into the broader ideas about management, and particularly around conscious capitalism, Shakti leadership, and healing organizations. In particular, conscious capitalism is about connecting businesses with broader socio-ecological purposes. And Shakti leadership bridges between masculine and feminine ways of being and leading in the world. Can you tell us more about your journey into those domains and how you navigated crossing some of those boundaries? So this connecting function.
Yeah, so with conscious capitalism, it was really sort of revealed in a way, or things that I learned when I studied those companies, which were in the book Firms of Endearment. We were 28, same number that you had in your book, by the way, 28 companies that made it into that set of so-called Firms of Endearment that were loved by all of their stakeholders. And we looked at what was common to them, what enabled this to happen. The original question was, how can you spend less money on marketing and yet have customers who are deeply loyal and trusting? Because the reality of the norm is the opposite. Companies spend a ton of money and customer loyalty and trust have plummeted. In fact, Michigan has done the customer satisfaction research over decades, right? And so, we're spending more and getting less. I was just looking for the opposite. How do we become more efficient, effective? And we found a whole different way of being, as I said. And then as we started to look for what was common to those companies, we discovered what we now call the pillars or tenets of conscious capitalism, starting with a higher purpose. The reason why all of these stakeholders are connected to this business in the first place is because they all believe in the same thing. If you're connected to Whole Foods as a customer, as an employee, as a supplier, as an investor, you pretty much believe in the fact that it matters what you put into your body, and it matters to your health and the health of the food system and the health of the planet. So in some way, you're already aligned, regardless of what role you play. So that sense of a shared purpose, which aligns all of your stakeholders together, and shared values as well, which kind of glue them and point you all in the same direction, right? So that was one of the common elements. So purpose, and then the stakeholder mindset. You try to create value for all of those, not just for customers and through the customers for investors, but actually you consciously seek to create value for employees, for suppliers, for communities, and so forth. And in order to do that, you need leaders with a different mindset, with a different lens, who are not there to use other people to achieve their goals, but who are there to take people to a better place, to serve the purpose of the organization and to have a positive impact on people. So conscious leaders. And then cultures, which are not just about accountability and performance, but are about caring and trust and authenticity and transparency and so forth. So we discovered those 4 pillars, as I said, through that, and then we built upon that over time. One of the things that I had observed just working on just the name of that book kind of gives that, is that there is in conscious companies more of the so-called feminine energy. That doesn't mean it's necessarily more men. It just means that we have more of the caring, compassionate side that's evident in those leaders and in those cultures. So I had been talking about the rise of feminine values in society generally, and that is for a number of reasons. A lot of it has to do with education, that women now outnumber men significantly. I think it's close to about 60% now of college students are women. It's even more so in many graduate programs. So what that says, and this has been going on, by the way, 1989 was the year when we had more cumulatively women college graduates and men, and this is a global phenomenon. This is not just US. Everywhere except South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, women outnumber men. And therefore, white-collar professions will be, statistically at least, dominated by women. And more women are rising into leadership. So we're starting to see a gradual shift. After millennia, where every institution has been run by men on a limited set of masculine values, this is the century when that is changing and could change in a very significant way. And that will impact everything in society. And by the way, I believe it is at the core of almost every issue, from the planet to global peace, to income inequality, to many other factors, is that extreme imbalance. And when you don't have balance, you get the toxic negative aspects of the dominating energy. When you have balance, you can stay with the positives of both. So I had been observing that, and we had a conference actually at Bentley about one of our Conscious Capitalism conferences had that theme, the rise of feminine values, and then from that arose the idea of that book. Nilima Bhatt is based in India, and she's deeply versed sort of in the ancient wisdom of India, and it's a culture that celebrates goddesses and that embodies this idea of Shakti, which is the animating energy that drives everything in the universe, and that is really embodied, seen as a feminine force, feminine energy. So we just use that word to kind of capture the essence of that we need to bring that divine, life-giving, life-sustaining energy into leadership and into business. And how do we do that? And so the Shakti leadership model is really, it starts with presence. And as Andy talked about, we are conduits. We are receiving from source in some way, right? I mean, things come through us, but that doesn't happen until you're fully present. Once you are in a state of presence, then you actually become a conduit, right? You connect to something greater. So it starts with presence, and then it's cultivating wholeness. And the wholeness includes healing the masculine-feminine divide within us, the yin-yang, all of that. And also we talk about wholeness in terms of the elder and the child. And ultimately the summary phrase that we now use is the wise fool of tough love. How do you become the wise fool of tough love? You have wisdom of the elder. You have the playfulness of a child. You have, the toughness, the healthy masculine, and you have love. It's all rooted in love, right? Which is the healthy feminine energy. And how do you cultivate that? Most of us don't actually have all of those capacities or dimensions. It's like a diamond with facets, right? We haven't polished those, but we can. What is my version of an elder? What is my version of wisdom? What is yours? How do I awaken the healthy inner child? How do I actually heal that inner child? Because most of us have wounded. We have traumas, right? And therefore we don't have, and therefore we act out. And it's violence and aggression really comes from unhealed childhood traumas in many cases. So how do we have the healthy inner child? From there, we get creativity and joy and humor and playfulness. You can't be really creative unless you are connected to that source. So how do you become wise and foolish at the same time, and loving and strong? All of that. That's how we define wholeness. And then we need to have flexibility. You need to know what's needed in a given situation. You don't show up with the same energy regardless, right? You show up with wisdom or love or toughness or humor. And then meanwhile, all the while you have to stay congruent. You have to be aligned with your higher purpose. In India, we call it dharma. What is your unique, dharma, right? What's your purpose? What are you meant to? What are with the gifts that you were given and endowed? What is your unique gift to contribute here? And how do you stay connected and aligned with that?
Thanks, Raj. Yeah, Andy, I just want to bring this back to, Raj was talking about sort of connection to the feminine energy and the earth energy. And your work has been a lot around sustainability, and particularly dealing with the big macro wicked problem of sustainability, a topic that's still not entirely accepted in many of our academic institutions. And that businesses, I think, sometimes give, there's some comments about Coca-Cola here and Home Depot, that businesses give lip services to, but don't really fully implement. Yet doing good work on sustainability requires connecting the dots, connecting across multiple disciplines, theories, ways of thinking, types of education and relationships. Can you give us a little background on how you think about that?
I mean, I think our students are there already. I think that 20 years ago, when I first started teaching, students who wanted to change the world went into schools of government and nonprofit management. Today, more and more of them are going into schools of business. Unfortunately, the professors are a little slow to catch up, and we need to start to change how we teach these students to bring that out in them. And that idea of connectedness among disciplines and connectedness between their role as a business leader and the natural and social environments that they will have tremendous impact on. The students who graduate from business school are going to have tremendous power in our world. And to my mind, we have not connected the responsibility that comes with that power. And we need to. And so when I think about my development and how I try and teach, I mean, I do try and teach about helping students cultivate their calling, their vocation in management, to serve, to improve the world around them, not just make themselves rich. If we continue to produce MBAs that just want to make themselves rich, we're done. We're doomed. We'll have more Enrons and WorldComs. And right now, the education system and the system they walk into makes it hard for them to do that. John Gamble, a corporate attorney, wrote a really interesting essay in Medium called The Most Important Idea in the World. Check it out. And what he says in there is that the system in which business people work compels them to be sociopaths, to care only about themselves, not the natural world around them and not other people around them, focus only on themselves. And that's textbook sociopath. I've had students come to me and say, when they walk into the business school building, they feel like their values are under attack. But if we provide content that will allow them to bring that self forward and make themselves whole, bring the whole student in the education process, we've become too transactional in education, and help people develop that side of them. They're ready, they're there. So for example, I taught a course last year called Business and Democracy, Advocacy, Lobbying, and the Public Interest. I'm stunned how few business schools have courses on lobbying, and far less have anything on constructive lobbying, on being stewards of capitalism, stewards of the market, making sure it serves everybody. I mean, before COVID, the Federal Reserve had a statistic that 40% of Americans could not pull together $400 in an emergency. They're in that emergency right now. That's caused by the market that these students will go into. And if they have no obligation to maintaining a stable market, a sustainable market, once again, we're doomed. And so how do we teach them to be stewards of the market? We teach them that capitalism is not a fixed state. There are many ways we got here, many ways we can go. And we have to decide how we want to do that. So I offered this course. It was crossed between the School of Public Policy and the School of Business. And as you know, when you offer a new course, it's like a new car. No one buys it. They wait for you to work the bugs out. This course was oversubscribed. The students want this. Rebecca Henderson teaches a course at the Harvard Business School. She started it just to see how it would go. It's called Reimagining Capitalism. And it's exploded in interest. So I think that we have an opportunity before us. The students are ready. And all we have to do is follow. That's the funny thing. It's not as hard as it may sound. The challenge is going against the rules that are around us. And this whole conversation, for me, boils down to, are you driven by external rewards? Are you driven by internal rewards? And Herbert Shepard, who I'm sure has come up in these sessions, a wonderful thinker on organizational behavior, but also on the idea of being who you are. He has a paper. It's called On a Path with a Call, Realizing a Path with a Heart. Oh boy, I'm screwing it up. I think that's what it's called. A Path with a Heart. And he asks the question, are you a cormorant? Now, a cormorant is a bird that's really good at catching fish. So the fisherman knows it. He puts a band around the bird's neck, a rope around its foot, throws it in the water. Bird comes back with a fish. The fisherman takes it, throws it back in the water all day. The fisherman will do this all day. The bird is doing what it's really good at, but for somebody else's purpose. Are you a cormorant? And I dare say a lot of our education system is trying to teach people how to be cormorants, to squelch that idea of who they are as a person. Anytime I hear a student begin a statement, speaking as a business person, I stop them right away. Say, You are not going to exclude your entire being and narrow things down to just a narrow, which is often a bogus stereotype of what a business person is. So that is kind of how I'm trying to put all this stuff together in my teaching, and my research, and my writing. My writing is moving much more towards books for a general audience. I find it truly bizarre that we in academia are rewarded for writing to other academics, and we are not rewarded for writing to our students or to business people. I find that truly bizarre. And I'm a full tenured professor, so screw it, I'm going to do it anyway.
If I could just tag on to that, Sandra, I was a junior professor at George Mason University. I think I was up for tenure that year, 1995 or something it was. And something happened in the news, and there was a big merger between Disney and Cap Cities, which was ABC. And I had the idea to write an op-ed. And I did the same morning, and I sent it to the Wall Street Journal, and they published it the next morning, right? So I was thinking, well, that's not bad, right? I got to apply some of what I know about the theory about mergers and whatnot. I get a knock on my door from the most senior professor we had there, who was a distinguished, he had come over from Harvard. He was towards the end of his career, and he came to George Mason. And I thought he would say, good job, Raj. Without even saying good morning, he said, what the hell are you doing? And I was like, God, what did I do? What do you mean, Bob? He said, why are you writing for the Wall Street Journal? You should be in here working on your journal articles, right? Publishing in journal marketing. I said, well, I had done some research in the second order synergy or whatever, and I thought this was something worth pointing out. And he said, that's not your job. Don't do that again, right? And then he walked away. And then he turned around and said, by the way, why didn't you cite my research in that article? And then I get a call from one of my friends who's a professor at Georgia Tech, and he says, congratulations on the Wall Street Journal piece. I said, thanks. He said, you do realize this is academic suicide, don't you? And at that point, before I was confused, and I was just angry. I said, this is bullshit, this is like, who are we like some ivory tower, philosophers, and even philosophers, I think, should engage with the challenges of the day and in our world, So this idea that we should have nothing to do with practice, it was just ridiculous. Fortunately, I could have, shied away completely. And fortunately, I kind of stuck to that. But I agree with Andy. And this whole idea of books not being valued, I've struggled with that for years. And like him, I've said, I don't care. I'm going to do what I'm called to do. Right. And my measure is different than your measure. I believe I want to see positive impact. I don't want to just see impact. I want to see the kind of impact that we need. If I help somebody get another couple of cents of earnings per share, that's not meaningful to me. But if it can shift mindsets and awaken consciousness and change the lived experience of people in businesses and from businesses, yeah, that's what is meaningful to me. So. And as I said, your book has given, I talked to somebody else who's in your book, and I won't name him, but he said for many years, I felt ashamed of my own work. And this person has done world-changing work. We all recognize, right? He said, I was ashamed because I wasn't doing the standard thing, right? At the end of the year, I wasn't pointing to, in my field, general marketing research and general marketing, right? But I was having enormous impact. And yet he had that, and your book, Sandra, gave him and others a sense of greater confidence and belief that, yeah, what we're doing is worthwhile and we should continue. In fact, we should double down on it.
Yeah, I believe that too, Raj and Andy. I'm from both of your comments. Wanting what I was going to say earlier about intellectual shamans is they become who they must be. They don't follow the dictates of society or of the academy or of, your mom and dad who told you what you had to do. But it is literally responding to something that's a calling. And Andy, I know you've spoken a lot about this notion of calling. Maybe you want to comment a little bit on that too.
I think it's important to recognize that it's a balance. It's a challenge. It would be irresponsible for me to tell a junior faculty member, just do whatever you want, follow your heart, and the world is going to work out great. there are times you have to figure out when to fit in and times when you have to figure out when to break out. And there's a progression over time. Deb Meyerson writes about the idea of the tempered radical and the idea that you pick your battles, you grow in your influence, you're tempered, you fit, but you're a radical, you think differently. I'm a tenured, full chaired professor. If there's ever a time where I can be a radical, it's now. The problem, I think, is that the system indoctrinates people into thinking that by the time they get to the position we're in right now, keep doing what they were doing before. I had a colleague say to me, the problem with our field is we got too many junior professors thinking like senior professors. And all this, I'm talking about academia, we could talk about any career path, any profession. You know, people who get to the top of any corporation, do they maintain their radical ideas? I'm in a project right now, we're interviewing Paul Pullman. How in the world did he get to CEO and still think these crazy things? How did he do that? How do you do that? How do you succeed while thinking differently? It's a challenge and it's a balance. And it would be totally unwise to not be political and smart about this and choose when to step outside the lanes. But always keep in mind, when you have the chance, step outside the lanes, because, you know, full professors is a gift. It's a beautiful gift. And I'm not saying check out and work on your golf game. I'm saying it's a time to define the role for yourself and be who you were ultimately meant to be. And you can't just check out for 15, 20 years and then suddenly engage that passion. You got to keep it cultivated throughout so that when the opportunity arises, you start to grow. But also, those of us who have gotten to the position of success, we have an obligation now to try and make it easier for others to follow. And so that's what I think our role is to maintain the profession, to help it where it's broken, which it is, both in terms of business and in terms of academia, and do more of that. You know, Raj talked about the idea of academic suicide, and I've been accused of that many times. I've accused myself of that. But, you know, if you're not taking a risk, if you're not doing anything important, if you're not, you know, two quotes I always use to help me deal with hate mail, and they apply to anything stepping outside the bounds. One, if you're not offending anyone, you never took a stand. It's a great quote. I haven't figured out who said it. It's been attributed to Winston Churchill. I don't know. Second quote comes from Paul Newman. If you don't have enemies, you don't have character. This is important because if you do want to be this out of the box thinker, get ready. They're going to be people who will criticize you, who will attack you, who will think you are not doing what you're supposed to do. Some will do it out because they genuinely believe you're making a mistake. Others because they're afraid, because you're doing something they would love to have the guts to do, and they don't want to believe it's possible. And therefore, they don't want you to do it. And so the three of us in this room, and there are many others, need to start to speak out more of how to fix what's wrong in the institutions in our society.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back. I mean, certainly, I just want to reflect on the fact that being a woman and trying to do some of those things makes it even harder. Because, you know, I don't know if it was career suicide or not, but early on, I started doing research on corporate responsibility and, you know, public-private partnerships and making business better. And, you know, there were people who told me, what are you doing? You're nuts. But that takes me back to the whole idea of the corporation. You've both written a lot about corporations. Joel Bakken has a book that's now 20 years old called The Corporation, in which he described the corporation as a sociopath. He's got a new one out that looks at corporations that have adopted a lot of corporate social responsibility measures and said it's just as psychopathic as it used to be. And I know both of you have written about, Andy, you've written about sustainability in corporations, and Raj, you've written about conscious capitalism and healing organizations. How do we turn corporations into the healing entities and the force for good in the world that they could be? And whoever wants to start, please start.
Well,
go ahead, Raj.
Oh, sorry. So, you know, I do feel like in our movement, we started Conscious Capitalism in 2008. And now 13 years later, you know, we seem to be moving into a different phase of the conversation. So we've got chapters in about 20 countries and 40 US cities. And there are other parallel movements that are having the same, making the same similar arguments. I think in 2019, with the Business Roundtable changing its definition of business, with Davos issuing that stakeholder capitalism call, with BlackRock and others who have been changing how they invest. And so I think we're approaching, I believe, at least a conceptual tipping point in practice, not in academia necessarily, where purpose is almost mainstream out there. I mean, every big consulting firm has a big practice around it, and every big company is talking about it. The idea of stakeholder management is becoming mainstream. I don't hear a lot of arguments in the other direction anymore, even though practice may continue in that way. So I think there is something close to a tipping point in terms of the theory of the business and what people at least articulate at the corporate level. And so the conversations we're having, or I'm having now, it used to be, what is this and why should we do this and what's broken and why does it need to be changed? And now it's really more about, okay, we get it, but how do you do it? I think the how question is becoming more central now. And that's certainly my experience working with CEOs and groups of CEOs. We just did 2 big programs with 25 and 100 CEOs in them. And really, it's really around how. How do you, okay, fine, we should have a purpose. How do you go about it? How do we find a compelling, actionable, impactful, real purpose that's not just a clever tagline, but actually makes a difference and brings to life certain energies within all of our stakeholders, aligns them, inspires them, mesmerizes them. The stakeholder one is not easy. How do you, in fact, not only serve all your stakeholders at a deeper level, rather than use them, right? So we're not exploiting them, we're serving them. But then how do you connect them together? How do you make it a win-win? It's easy to be trade-off minded, right? I've been focusing too much on investors, and therefore I need to cut back there, and I need to pay my employees more, or whatever it might be. It's not about rebalancing, it's integrating. And it is saying, how do we find the win-win? How do we do things that are simultaneously beneficial to all of them? And that requires tremendous creativity. But the one thing we know is that I think the single unlimited thing in the planet is human creativity. I don't know, we haven't reached the limits of that. So if we engage that creativity, we will more often than not break the trade-offs and find the solutions. And Ed Freeman has lots of great examples of this happening in companies. Right? When the CEO says this must happen, the sustainability is not negotiable. Otherwise we shut down the plant. A week later they come back and say, wait a minute, we know how to do this and we can actually save money doing it. So I think it's really, as I said, so we wrote a book called The Field Guide, Conscious Capitalism Field Guide, Tools for Transforming the Organization, which is our collection of what we know and what others have come up with as ways to do these things. How do you create purpose? How do you serve stakeholders and align them? How do you assess your culture and then evolve it in the direction that we need towards trust and caring and authenticity? And of course, leadership is a perennial topic, and conscious leadership is something that many people are talking about. Leaders who are rooted in their own unique purpose and being authentic to who they are and leading from that place of genuine service. The acronym I use for that is selfless. So conscious leaders have to have transcended the self. They're not about serving the small self anymore. They're about serving the collective and taking people to a better place, and then it stands for all the qualities. So those are the conversations we're having, and I think it's doable. It is definitely a journey that many companies are on. And Paul did it at Unilever over his decade there. Many other companies are doing it, are on the journey. Some companies get derailed. I have had 2 examples of large companies that got on the journey. The CEO was excited, and then in both cases, the board of directors decided to merge with another company, and everything was thrown out the window, and it went back to just numbers, and profits. And so that can happen. I think the boards are critical in this conversation, especially for public companies. And they are typically even older and more male than leaders are. And therefore, they have a more conventional view of business still compared to many CEOs.
Andy, you want to respond?
Sure. I mean, you asked the question, how do we make companies more fill in the blank?
Responsible, ethical,
I think
society.
the answer to that question, there's no one answer.
Right.
Everyone listening, all of us on this panel, every one of us, to my mind, needs to examine where is their scope of influence and apply pressure in that domain. A lot of things that happen, for example, in Washington are beyond my scope of influence. And so I can say, fix Washington, but that doesn't, that takes me out of the conversation. So where's my scope of influence? Well, I'm a professor, so I touch students. So I'm going to change the students that graduate. For example, we have too many people who think of corporations as monoliths. Corporations are sociopathic. Corporations do this. ExxonMobil did that. That's not true. Corporations are collections of individuals, and within those corporations are people who want to do the right thing. And so how do we create more of those? Given my position as a professor, I want to create more of those and put them out there to go into organizations and be sort of antibodies to what's going on. That's my place. I would also add that my place is also as a professor, and use my platform as a professor to try and push ideas. Raj brought up the idea of the World Economic Forum. It's talked about re-examining the purpose of the corporation. So is the Business Roundtable, so is BlackRock. I look at these statements, I think, great. They're aspirational statements, but if you look at what they're doing, they're not doing much. But they said it. So what can we do within the business schools of the world to say, okay, how do you do that? Let's talk about that. There are companies talking about going carbon neutral now, going carbon negative. Great, you said that. I don't believe you're going to do it. You know, as they say, trust us, don't track us, don't trust us. But I'm going to use that as a foray to start a conversation, given my platform as a professor, to say, okay, there's the question. How do we answer that? How do we move forward? All of this always for me keeps coming back to what legacy do you want to have? What impact do you want to have on the world around you? You know, David Brooks' last book, The Second Mountain, I really enjoyed. You know, the first mountain is status and achievement and accolades, and the second mountain is relationship. It's about purpose. It's about meaning. It's about connection. And a question I'm asking myself right now with my students is, can we get them to skip the first mountain, go straight to the second? I mean, Brooks borrows from a lot of people. Carl Jung talked about this a lot, that we have this thing called a midlife crisis that we've trivialized into something like getting a Porsche and divorcing your wife. But in reality, it's a re-examination of everything I've been pursuing in my life and realizing it's not the right pursuit. And you cop out by buying a Porsche. What you should instead be doing is saying, what is the real purpose and meaning behind my life? How do we get that into students earlier? It's a really interesting question. And can the students do that early in their life, or do they need that step of status? I'm hoping that I can at least shorten their time on the first mountain so that they'll go out and answer the questions that people like the Business Roundtable asked.
So it's really a systemic issue that pressures, I think, our students, or most of us, to go for this sense of achievement and accomplishment in a material sense, rather than something following whatever bliss or deeper purpose we might have.
A very visible manifestation of that is the number of students that go into finance and consulting. Why do they go there? Because that's where the salaries are. Now, some of them have to do that because the debt load we saddle them with after business school is just too great. But a lot of them go there because, hey, that's status. I'm cool. I work for McKinsey. I got a $50,000 signing bonus and my salary is higher than yours. Tim Hall at Boston University studies careers. And there's a story he told me one time that I've loved ever since. He said he was talking to a woman who's really successful in her industry. She accomplished everything and she was miserable. And then she looked in the mirror one morning and said, oh my God, an 18-year-old picked my career. And I love that because she set her sights on the status of an 18-year-old and never looked back until she suddenly stopped and said, wait a minute, this isn't what I want to do. That's the first and second mountain. She was about to enter the second mountain. How do we get students there in the first place? I think many of them there already, to be honest with you.
I certainly find that my students, now I'm teaching a university-wide course, so I'm drawing not from just the business school, but from arts and sciences and nursing and education as well. And I think they partly take the course which is called Leadership and Mindfulness, because they're interested in making a difference in the world. So I find them coming in with that, and they are undergraduates. I want to pick up a question that appeared in the, or it's sort of a comment, but I thought maybe the two of you could comment on it. It's a comment that appeared in the chat box, and it says, perhaps the panelists could speak about how the whole system is rigged, as a premise, and drives cognitive dissonance that simply does not allow a new way to emerge. The boxes are designed so that everything must fit or be excluded. And I think you've been talking about that in terms of some of the careerism, but in terms of what the expectations are of companies, I think that's a huge problem, because we expect companies to, quote unquote, maximize shareholder wealth. And unless we change that and change the boxes in which companies are put, then we're going to continue to get the same behaviors. So again, back to the sort of thinking about what are the levers in which where we can push this type of change to be happening. Andy, you want to start?
Well, yeah, I mean, how do I say this? There's a lot of myths out there. The myth that the purpose of the corporation is to make money for its shareholders. That's a myth. Even to the point where people think it's in corporate law. It's not. If shareholders try and sue a corporation, sue the CEO because shareholder price dropped, good luck. They're going to run smack into the good business rule, good judgment rule. And if a CEO gathered the information that was available to him or her, made a decision they thought was in the best interest of the company, they're not going to get into trouble. And so, how do we think about the question in a different way? The system is rigged. Well, yeah, every set of institutions has a set of rules that we are compelled to follow. How do we change those? How do we act differently? And how many of those rules are myths? You know, how many of them are self-imposed because we think that's what the rules are when in fact they're not? I think that happens a lot. I think that we live in a society right now of tremendous conformity because people are looking for easy answers and easy information. I'm not challenging the questioner at all. But I refuse to just go to that it's rigged and therefore it's unsolvable. It's broken. It can be fixed. And rigged just means designed for a particular purpose, and it's a purpose I don't agree with. But it is not, it's not set in stone. And it has pockets of deviance, you know, positive deviance they talk about in this area of positive organizational scholarship. I mean, look at Raj and I. I mean, the rigged system should have spit us out long ago. It hasn't. And you too, Sandra. I mean, we should have been spit out, but we're not. How did that happen? Well, maybe the system wasn't quite as rigged as we thought it was. And maybe there was places where we could deviate and not get hammered for it. I'd prefer to think about it that way. At the very least, fight the good fight.
I think it's, Raj, it's about the sense-making function in a sense. Can you respond to this notion too?
Yeah. I mean, we know plenty of examples of companies that are not following. I mean, Paul came in and said, I'm not going to give quarterly guidance, right? I mean, just as one example. And he did many other things. These are just norms or rules that they're not even really rules, or they're just standard operating practice. And we need to challenge every one of those. You know, we need to be rule breakers and rule challengers, certainly. And we know the phrase goes, if something exists, it must be possible. And this exists in spades. There's lots of that, plenty of examples of that out there. So we can certainly do this at a company level and succeed. You know, tons of research showing this way actually succeeds better. In firms of endearment were 9-1 over 10 years over the market, right? Now, I don't claim that that is a universal ratio or anything like that, but tons of evidence, and not just that, but explanation as to why that is, right? Why does it work better when you do things in this way? There are also institutional solutions that are coming out. The long-term stock exchange is one of them. You know, this is just starting out now. It's been approved. I think you can list there. But the idea, it addresses one of the fundamental problems with traditional stock markets, which is the short-termism. You can buy 9.5% of a company's shares today, and then tomorrow you can issue proxies and try to get their board of directors fired and, you know, and shift their entire direction and get them to shed their purpose and or many other things like that, right? And this stock exchange would say, no, if if you just bought your shares, then you are not really an investor, right? So the longer you hold on to your shares, the more your voting power grows. So you're a true investor versus a speculator. And this gets rid of the problem of, activist investors who are really activist on behalf of themselves just to make a quick flip and get a company to do certain things that will give, a bump to the share price. And that hurts a lot of good companies. A lot of conscious companies are threatened by that, are choosing to go private because they don't want to deal with the pressures of activist investors. And that's how actually Whole Foods ended up as part of Amazon. They got attacked by two activist investors because of I believe, a short-term 30% dip in their share price as a result of some shifting market conditions. They would have adapted and come back had they had the opportunity to remain independent. So I think those are the kinds of structural solutions that are needed. But I agree with Andy that this becomes an excuse not to do anything and throw your hands up and say, oh boy, there's nothing we can do. There's a lot we can do. We have a lot of degrees of freedom still.
And if I could add something here, this question has a certain tone of activism to it. And I'd like to shift it a little bit to being authentic, living authentically. I had a student come to me and say, what's the point of my reducing my carbon emissions? It's not going to change global concentrations. I said, if that's your goal, don't do it. But if you're trying to live by your values and live a life of authenticity, do it for that reason and do it for that reason alone. And trust me, you'll stick to it a lot longer than if you're doing it just to reduce the global CO2 concentration. So think about that across your life. We are employees, we are consumers, we are voters. We have many different aspects in our lives in which we can live authentically. And I mean, one idea of a vocation in business is to say, what do you do? Who are you in your personal life? Who are you at business? Are they two different people? If you're two different people, a house divided cannot stand. And so if you vote one way, consume another way, work another way, it won't work. Try and bring all the pieces together to live a life of authenticity. And then you know what's interesting going to happen? First of all, you're going to see things as you move down the path that you couldn't see before. And second, people are going to look at you and they're going to admire what you're doing and they're going to mimic you. They're going to see you as a role model. I'm not, how do I say this without sounding puffed up? I'm not trying to be puffed up, but when I first started on this idea of thinking differently as a business, as an academic professor, having impact in the real world, my first thought was, how do I change the institutions? I got to change the university. And I realized I'm Don Quixote. I mean, I'm tilting at windmills. The institution is huge. What I did realize is that just by doing this and surviving, other people are watching and saying, oh, that's a way that I hadn't seen. And maybe it can work, and maybe I'll do it too. And so lead by example. I don't proselytize, I don't preach, maybe a little bit, but live the life that you think is authentic. And I do think that you can have change within your circle of influence and grow in that influence. Every vista you hit, you get to see more.
It's interesting because people have said, oh, you've written so much or whatever, you've done so much. And it's like, it's one step after the other. You just keep doing what you need to do. And if you do enough of it, they can't kind of question you after a while because you've got the record that maybe some of your colleagues don't even have. And you've ended up doing something that you wanted to do because it was what you were called to do.
Yale University does a survey every year, the Six Americas study. And there's a question I always like to watch. Do you talk about climate change with family or friends? 10 years ago, it was around 25%. Now it's around 38%. That to me is social change happening. If people hear from someone at the coffee table says, you know what, I think climate change is a hoax, people are pushing back and saying, no, it's not. And you're seeing it a lot now. I'm not going to get a vaccine. And a lot of people are pushing back and saying, oh, really? On what do you base that? That changes people's minds more than Al Gore on TV telling us what's wrong with the climate. All politics is local. Tip O'Neill said that, and it's true.
Yeah. So this whole idea of shaman is about healing, intellectual or otherwise, and holism, and doing this type of work that been talking about, where you're operating in a very sort of, as we all are, in a very sort of mainstream institution of some sort, whether it's business or in our cases academia, and yet you're sort of stepping outside the norms because you're called to do something, and it's essentially a call to the sense of the sacred, something that is sacred in us that says we have to do this, and that to me gives the potential for being transformative. So I don't know, Raj, I know you've had this kind of spiritual journey going on, and I wonder if you could just kind of speak to that, and then we'll come back around to Andy.
Yeah, so 2018 I mentioned was the year I turned 60, and that is a natural milepost to reflect, right? Because more of your life is way more is behind you than in front of you, and so I was doing that, but I was also writing the healing book at the time, and I had a book deadline for October, and I was full steam ahead as usual. But then I got this advice from several different people, all women, that you need to slow down. I mean, you're rushing from one project to another, one airport to another. If you're going to write about healing, you better work on your own healing first. Not that you will be fully healed, but at least you need to make that effort and that journey and understand. Otherwise, anything you write is not going to be meaningful or authentic. So fortunately, I listened, and I opened myself up to experiences that year. And we went to the Shakti Leadership Group. We organized these spiritual journeys to various places around the world, from Machu Picchu to Israel to the Ganges in India and so forth. So we were doing a trip. My co-author was leading a trip to Ladakh, which is a remote region in India on the border with Tibet. Extremely high altitudes, 20,000 feet, mountain crossings and so forth. It's an area of deep Buddhist wisdom, right? Like the Tibetan Buddhism and all of that is in that region. So I said yes to that, and that was, if you want to learn about suffering and healing, I mean that's a great place to focus on that and to meditate on that. I had a silent retreat in upstate New York with Peter Senge and David Cooperrider and some others at a place called Peace Village. And, it's amazing we don't have space for silence in our lives very much. And it's incredible what even 3 or 4 days of that can do. And as you said, opening you up to that source. And I was just receiving so many insights about my own life and making sense of things. And really ultimately getting enough ideas that I said, I want to write another book after I write the healing book about everything that I'm learning about my life and my journey. So that's what I'm doing right now. I also went on a journey down to the to be with actual shamans in the Ecuadorian rainforest with the Pachamama Alliance. Lynn and Bill Twist started this 25 years ago. It's about connecting the indigenous wisdom that's being lost with the modern world. And what have we forgotten, especially our connection to nature? I mean, we are embedded, we are part of nature as much as that tree I'm looking at, and yet we separate ourselves. And so how do we make that deep connection? And then part of that was a shamanic healing, a series of shamanic healing ceremonies, including an ayahuasca. For those of you who don't know, ayahuasca is this thing that they've used for thousands of years in these cultures. Anytime they're going through a significant life transition, anytime there's serious illness or disease, I mean, the shaman will take that, and they get access to certain levels of consciousness. It basically quiets the ego. It essentially shuts down what's called the default mode network for those hours in your brain, and then you open up to other realizations. So I had a profound experience with that. So I did all of these things and came to many realizations and about my own life journey and about why I experienced what I did as a 2-year-old, as a 7-year-old, as a the things I saw and experienced and where I came from and the influences, and how that then connects to something that 50 years later results in why the Shakti book, because I experienced the extreme opposite of that and so forth, and how the whole thing kind of fits together, at least for me it did. And realized also, and for me, uncovering severe traumas, significant things that I had brushed under the carpet and said, I don't need any healing, I'm fine. But it turns out, yeah, those are traumas. If I describe them to you, say, wow, that's a pretty big deal. And so I was able to, I had to then confront my own need for healing. and addressing those traumas in whatever way was appropriate for each of those experiences. And writing about that has been part of the journey. So I'm writing a book called Awaken, A Journey from Harmony to Healing. Because for most of my life, I was seeking harmony, false harmony. I was trying to fit in. I had a father who was so overbearing and dominant. My thing, when there was so much conflict, I was always just striving for harmony at all costs. And harmony is good, but if you strive for false harmony, that's not good. There is necessary conflict that we need to engage in, right? There are things that need to be confronted. There are battles that need to be fought. And so the harmony is not healing. So I kind of have to go from being a chief harmony officer to ultimately a chief healing officer. What does that mean, right? What is genuine healing? And so that's what I'm doing right now. It's kind of a memoir, manual, what have I learned in my 63 years now almost. So that's been kind of the journey of self-realization, self-awareness, self-healing. And by the way, in the middle of that, both my parents passed away. And so that became a very significant, milestone again and turning point in my life and evolving, and making peace with my father before he left. And his last words to me after I thanked him for everything he had done for us, despite all of our challenges, he said, "Raj, you are your own boss." And he didn't expand on it. I said, well, that sounds like a good thing to me, right? I mean, he used to say that I'd never listened to him and I did my own thing. And, he would frame it as a selfish thing. Like, you don't care about you should listen to what I say. That's good for the whole family. But I think ultimately all of us, I think at some level need to be our own bosses, right? I just hate the word boss to begin with. I think nobody in the world needs a boss. That's a term that comes from slavery, from the Dutch word baas. But I think we are the captains of our own ships and we need to take charge of that as early as possible and not wait until we're 60, hopefully. I mean, for me, it was 47 when I discovered my purpose, but really 60 when I got to this place of deeper understanding and trying to heal.
Thank you, Raj. And Andy, could you maybe respond? And then we'll turn it back to Jim.
Your question about stepping outside the lanes, I think you said, I would question whether the lanes exist. That the purpose in life is not to stay within lanes, and many of those lanes are self-imposed. Socrates said a life unexamined is not worth living. To my mind, life is a constant searching and constant growing and expanding and testing the boundaries and exploring who you are at the time you need it. We're always faced with opportunities for that examination. We're in one right now. If I may, I pulled it up while you were talking, that Arundhati Roy has a really nice short essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal." And she writes, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." That, to me, to your question, says those lanes have changed. And it's a question of whether they existed before, how rigid they were. And everybody has a different set of lanes. So I think about it more just your periods of personal growth, pursuit, and taking on the challenges. I love Thomas Berry's idea of the great work. He says every generation is faced with a great work. They didn't choose it, it's imposed upon them, and they have no choice but to respond. He does say the nobility of our generation will be defined how well we respond to that great work. I think about things that way. The great work before us right now, for me, is really around the market, around climate change, around income inequality, around racial equality. That's the great work before, as I see it. Everyone else has different great work, but those are the big challenges before us. That's what I want to work on. Any lanes that say I shouldn't work on those are lanes that I refuse to acknowledge. Maybe I should have got spit out of academia. I probably could have. Maybe I didn't belong in academia. I don't know. But here I am. But I don't see it as so much a rigid set of rules is just a very fluid context in which I can operate. And, you know, I'm trying to live an authentic life by my own terms. I'm not perfect. I get it wrong often, but I keep striving. I keep pushing, and that's how I reframe your question: is are you striving towards that authentic self? Keep pushing, keep striving, and you'll make mistakes along the way. But you know, the best thing is to have tried.
Thank you. I want to thank both Andy and Raj for joining us today, and Jim for inviting me. And I just want to say, I think what both Raj and Andy have demonstrated is that it takes this sort of foresight, in a sense, although I think it's often retrospective foresight, looking back and seeing what you did to make sense out of it. But it also takes courage to follow your own path, to become, as I say in the book, who you must be. And I think both of you exemplify that. And I hope that people who have been listening have gotten something from this conversation. So Jim, over to you.
Sandra, Andy, Raj, magnificent session, magnificent session. And I was really struck, Andy, when you said that, you know, in the end, we've got to recognize that we're in a economic system gripped by psychosis. I think that's the bottom line for all of us to take in with ruthless realism, that our capitalist system, our business schools, everything that contributes to business as usual on planet Earth is in the grip of a psychosis. You know, what Carl Jung called mass hysteria. He said that what characterizes mass hysteria is when the individual people are all engaging in normal behavior, but what they're doing collectively can only be judged as insane. And of course, this is what he was referring to when he was talking about National Socialism and the Nazis in the German situation in the 1930s. But it also pertains to our situation today. And, you know, we've all been kind of sleepwalking through it. And, you know, Sandra, your question, how do you change business, is the question of how do you change a psychotically deranged individual. And one of the reasons why we are still careening out of control is because we think you can reform this incrementally, one little bit at a time, and try to green something that is fundamentally deranged. And I think I'm putting it starkly, both because we have very limited amount of time, but I would welcome, you know, a deeper dive into this nexus point that really explores, again, with what Mikhail Gorbachev called ruthless realism, how we engage ourselves in a radically deteriorating situation when we're all in the grip of a political economy that can only be described as either psychotic or in the grip of mass hysteria. And so I just want to put the question out there because I think it is something that the world has yet to meaningfully engage with, and thus we spin further and further out of control. And it's going to end up in disaster unless there's some fundamental reconceptualization of the meaning of economics. And in my view, capitalism needs to be superseded by donut economics, regenerative economics, in a radically time sensitive way. And that's one of the reasons why in Humanity Rising, we've been supporting regenerative economics and Kate Rayworth's donut economics because it completely reformulates what it means to be economic and also political in our time. I also want to note, Raj, your very, very sensitive closing comment and your journey down to Ecuador with the Pachamama Alliance. I made a similar journey with Pachamama and Lynn and Bill Twist about 20 years ago. And like you, sat under the aegis of these shamans on the ayahuasca journey. And I mention it because next week, as we continue our celebration of the 90th year of Stan Groff, we're going to be talking about the psychoactives, substances that LSD, ecstasy, ayahuasca that people take in highly therapeutic ways to enable them to engage in personal life transitions. So I appreciated that. And I just want to close by just saying to everyone that we've witnessed 3 shamans today. And they come in modern garb. They come out of the halls of the institutions that we reverence because they are there to train our young people and prepare them for the challenges of the next generation. So Sandra, thank you for this term, intellectual shamans. Thank you for your work. Thank you for bringing Andy and Raj together. And I hope we can see you again down the road because the interpretation of ancient wisdom into contemporary language and culture is one of the critical challenges of all of us. And I think the shamanic presence today has been very profoundly illuminating. And then tomorrow, everyone, we will be looking at Europe and the great European experiment in bringing people together, what Europe has done through the European Union since the end of the Second World War, and taking one of the most aggressive regions in history and re-amalgamating them into the largest peaceful region in the world that has endured now for 75 years, is one of the miracles of the entire historical journey of humankind, and is an example of how peace on earth is attainable if there's this radical shift of consciousness, like what happened to Europe at the end of the Second World War, when they saw the ashes of the Holocaust, the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the ashes of 50 million people dead. And they said, we have to change. And they did it within a few years. We've seen in the pandemic that the entire human race went into lockdown and started to engage in physical distancing like that because we changed consciousness. We can do it again about our economics, about the way we're relating with our larger ecology, and how we trigger that transmutation is probably the central question that humanity needs to address if we're to assure ourselves that the world beyond the pandemic is going to be more healthy and resilient and regenerative and in alignment with natural systems. And Europe provides a model. So we're going to be exploring all that same time, same station here on Humanity Rising tomorrow. But Sandra, Andy, Raj, brilliant, beautiful. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. We'll see you
And
again.
Sandra, could I just share one last thought because of what Jim was
Please.
so inspiring, and the whole shamanic angle on this. The most significant vision I had that night, lying on the banks of a river. It was a lunar eclipse night. We could see 6 planets lined up from horizon to horizon. And we had this deeply meaningful shamanic experience that went on all night. And the centerpiece of that was a vision that I got. I had gone there to learn about healing for my book and for myself. And I got this vision of these words that were floating. This is what the world needs to heal, and this is what business needs to heal. And the 4 words were love, innocence, simplicity, and truth. And that came as a preformed acronym. That's the list. And they said, we have gotten far away from all of these in all our institutions. We need to reconnect to love, to our essential. We are all born innocent and we get corrupted. Right? And we start using and abusing and manipulating and tricking. And we apply our intellect towards tricking and using others rather than serving. So we have to get back to some kind of strong innocence, right? Or knowing innocence. And simplicity. We've made too many things that we have made unnecessarily complex. The 2008 financial crisis was about manufactured complexity. And truth. What is our commitment to the truth? So I think that, to me, for me, that was a deep message that I received from somewhere. Obviously, I didn't make that up; it just came through me, and so I just wanted to share that, inspired by you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Wonderful final words. Love, innocence, simplicity, and truth. Bye, everyone. See you again tomorrow.
So long.
Okay.